At the time, I was starting my fellowship and starting to write grant proposals to get my career started as a medical research scientist. And I later did a lot of work as a cell biologist. And gosh, I was stunned by the fact that everything that these abductees were reporting on had happened to me. The accounts were so persuasive. The analysis by the investigators was so well done, so methodical. And as a scientist, I appreciated that I was convinced the phenomenon of alien abduction was real. Not only that, it had happened to me. But as a scientist, I couldn't imagine uh, being accepted by the scientific community. I didn't think I would be able to um, continue to be able to get funding from the National Institutes of Health, and I didn't want to, of course, affect my career and the career of my colleagues who I was doing research with at the time.
The following is a conversation with Dr. Bruce Rapuano. In this episode, we delve into something brand new for Tom and I, alien abduction encounters. And whilst we're aware of stories from people like Betty and Barney Hill, Travis Walton and Whitley Strieber, if we're honest, it's not an area we've covered on the podcast, certainly not with first-hand experiences. So we dig into this with an open mind and with a journalistic approach, because if we're honest, it's new territory for us, but fascinating nonetheless, and an area of the UFO UAP subject we haven't explored on the podcast or on the UAP Files Instagram account. Dr. Bruce Rapuano is a distinguished scientist whose career has spanned multiple disciplines from molecular biology to astrophysics. Bruce is not only a respected researcher and academic, but he's also an author with a truly unique story to tell. His book, Dominion Lost, A Scientist's Own Alien Abduction Encounters, is a compelling and provocative account that challenges our understanding of reality and explores the intersections of science and the paranormal. Bruce is an open book and answered all of our questions on his life, his career, the stigma, the encounter he experienced, and the scientific approach discussed in his books. So, the following is a conversation with Dr. Bruce Rapuano. Bruce, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. If it's okay, I'd just like to kind of find out from you, where did it first start with you, your interest in the subject, this sort of UFO, UAP, abduction subject? Where did that begin? Could you sort of talk us through the sort of journey to where you are now?
Now, that's a unique question. I haven't been asked before. I have to say, it began in the early 1960s. Believe it or not, we had that was that. I would say that was the beginning of what I describe in the book as, I call it, the UFO wave of 1965. But we really started to have a lot of sightings in the U.S. Pop up in '63, and I can remember as an 8-year-old child being fascinated with all the reports I had seen in the United Press International, Associated Press. I didn't even know what those were at the time, but I learned very quickly, reading these articles in our local newspaper talking about flying saucers, these circular shaped discs of metallic construction that were coming up, that were popping up all over the US at least. And for some reason, implicit in the articles I was reading, these articles that I wasn't used to reading our articles in our local newspaper in New Haven, Connecticut, of national significance. But implicit in these articles was the conclusion that these were not man-made, that they were potentially of interplanetary origin. And fast forward 2 or 3 or 4 years from that, I kind of lost interest because I became fascinated instead with the manned mission to the moon. That, since I was, even from an early age, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, I was very much interested in science, particularly in biology. But that interest in the UFOs was kind of replaced by an interest in the fact that we actually had a space program that intended to land human beings on the moon. But that's how it all began. And I have to say, maybe, let's see, so we landed on the moon in '69. And actually at that time, I think it was, I read the first article about the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill.
Mm.
And what was a very popular magazine at the time in the US called Look Magazine. And gosh, by the time I got to the end of that article, I don't know how or why, but I was convinced that it was real. That not only were there UFOs, we called them flying saucers at the time, but they're actually occupants inside the UFOs that were abducting people. And Betty and Barney Hill, the Betty and Barney Hill case being the first documented case of alien abduction. So I began to be maybe to have my interest in the general subject of UFO phenomena rekindled by reading that article, probably in the just I would say the last year or two in the 1960s.
Okay, so let's jump straight in then, if it's okay. Let's talk about your book and your experience. How did that come about? Obviously, you've got a background in science, and many people, I guess, would associate the subjects of abductions and UFOs in general and the phenomena as outside of science. And I know that we, us in the kind of UFO community, for lack of a better term, want to try and bring science and the science community and engineering community into the subject. I'm keen to know how you came to be involved in the subject of UFO, UAP, and abduction, and also how your science background has kind of shaped that, if that makes sense.
So in the 1980s, I was just starting my career as a biomedical research scientist at what was the top cancer hospital in the US, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. Now, at that time, there was almost an avalanche of these great books coming out in the US, not just about UFO phenomena, but about the alien abduction phenomena by groundbreaking UFO abduction investigators such as Bud Hopkins, the Harvard psychiatrist Dr. John Mack, and of course, Dr. David Jacobs. And I read all of their books. At the time, I was starting my fellowship and starting to write grant proposals to get my career started as a medical research scientist. And I later did a lot of work as a cell biologist. And gosh, I was stunned by the fact that everything that these abductees were reporting on had happened to me. And I could check literally every box in what I call the core alien abduction scenario that I was reading about in all these books. And the accounts were so persuasive. The analysis by the investigators was so well done, so methodical. And as a scientist, I appreciated that I was convinced the phenomenon of alien abduction was real. Not only that, it had happened to me. But what was I to do? I was at the beginning of my career, and I could very easily imagine if I came forward with my own accounts, wrote a book at that time, the way Whitley Strieber had done. He was the first really to go on record as an abductee. But as a scientist, I couldn't imagine being accepted by the scientific community. I didn't think that I would be able to continue to be able to get funding from the National Institutes of Health. And I didn't want to, of course, affect my career and the career of my colleagues who I was doing research with at the time. But now I'm at the end of my career, and we're in the middle of this, what I hope is an impending movement for disclosure by our government and our military here in the U.S., which I hope will be stimulated even further by public clamor. And I feel that no other scientist in the U.S. or in the world, for that matter, to my knowledge, has come forward with his own count by writing a first-person report of UFO close encounters and alien abduction. And I guess one of the main purposes of writing the book is to encourage other scientists, and I know there are many in the US and all over the world who have had the same experiences I've had, to also come forward. And in addition, those who haven't had the experiences to turn their attention toward this phenomenon, because it's been diverted away by the media and the government poo-pooing these accounts and even ridiculing many of the people that come forward with them. Which has really diverted the attention of the great majority of the scientific community from looking at it. And I would like to encourage as many scientists as possible to take it seriously and even consider investigating the phenomenon the way, for example, one name I'll bring up, the way Dr. Gary Nolan in the U.S. and Dr. Avi Loeb, who's the Harvard astrophysicist that's heading the Galileo project, are doing. We need a lot more people in the scientific community to look at this. I hope my book will kind of, contribute to disclosure in that fashion.
In a relevant way. That's a brilliant answer. Funny you mentioned, I mean, John Mack really made the bed for Avi Loeb, them both coming from Harvard. And I know that John Mack had some real problems with the stigma at the time. He was even dragged back into Harvard for a sort of investigation, and they told him what he couldn't and couldn't talk about. In your field as a biomedical research scientist, are you aware of any sort of similar kind of stigma, or where do you think that negativity comes from?
Well, it comes from historically the government criticizing people who come forward with not just reports of alien abduction, but the reports of UFOs or UFO close encounters, and of course, I think at the heart of that are probably military programs that covertly tried to understand every aspect of this phenomenon. And I don't know the degree to which they've been successful in understanding the technology. You have the book by Bob Lazar, who in detail claims that he was part of such a reverse engineering project. But I think they have technologies that they're studying that they want to keep secret. They want to keep the results of those covert research projects from being divulged to the point where our adversaries may get the jump on the research that our government, or excuse me, our military is doing. I don't know quite what to make of why we're having this movement for disclosure at the present time, other than the fact that there are whistleblowers that are coming forward that are courageous enough. I have no background in the government or the military, but fortunately there are people that are brave enough to come forward and say, look, these things exist. We're not alone. Our government not only knows a lot more than the public knows, but has been actively researching this issue for 50 years. So, I understand their reticence. It's an issue of national security that not only in the U.S. that we face, but we also face in the West with respect to the other members of the Western Alliance. But I'm hoping there are cracks in this edifice, but I can't really promise that that's going to materialize.
Yeah, very, very, very fair answer. So in the book then, Dominion Lost, it says your first encounter, you were about 2.5 to 3 years old. Is that right?
That's not quite right. That's the first recollection I have of actually, I call it in a chapter called The Stairway to an Alternate Reality. I had a sense memory where I was just climbing up some stairs with my mom at the age of 2 to 3 years old, and she picked me up, and almost as if that act of feeling of weightlessness or levitation, as it were, prompted the sense memory where I recalled having a relationship with alien humanoid beings that were much taller than I were, maybe 3.5 to 4 foot tall, disproportionately large, hairless heads. But not only a recollection of having a relationship with them, but remembering that they were my mentors, that I was being educated in some way, and that the sense I had at that very young age was that compared to these beings, my parents were like children. And yet this relationship had ended. I was now part of the world of human beings, and I felt a sense of almost abandonment and or longing that I was somehow had somehow transitioned from one world to another world. Now, 3 years later, approximately 3 years later, was when I first had an encounter where I recalled many details of the encounter. It was in the summertime in 1961. Incidentally, this was about 2 months before Betty and Barney Hill were abducted in New Hampshire. So I'm in Connecticut and I'm lying in bed at night. It's probably a dusk time, late July of 1961. I see, or I sense there's a reflection, a glint of light outside my bedroom window. I look to the right from my bed where I'd just been nodding off to sleep, and I see the strangest looking airplane I'd ever seen before. Very highly polished metallic surface, reflecting, highly reflective even in the waning sunlight. And it looks more circular than tubular. I thought I saw wings, but again, I'd never seen an airplane that looked like that, just flying over the rooftops of the apartment buildings in our neighborhood, maybe several blocks away. I do something very strange. Ordinarily, I would have been fascinated to continue to look at this strange flying object. Instead, I turn my head away from it as if under command. I turn to the left, immediately fall asleep. When I wake up, I'm not in my bedroom anymore, but I know I'm lying on a table. So I think it's an examination table because I immediately draw the conclusion I'm in some type of hospital or clinical setting. The table is too long and too wide to be that for a 6-year-old child, but I think I'm on an exam table. I'm distracted by some commotion, maybe 20 feet ahead of me, and I sit up and I see literally dozens of humanoid beings in a hallway outside the room I'm in. Half are walking from left to right, half are walking the other direction. They seem to be walking they're very busy. They're walking with a clear seriousness of purpose about them. And I draw the conclusion that they're doctors. In fact, I know this because I immediately pointed at them when I noticed that they were there and called out to them indignantly saying, "Hey, you're not my doctors. In other words, why have you brought me here?" And these beings clearly fit the anatomical stereotype of the classic gray alien. And at that point, I've called attention to myself, and I think I felt what was like a hand on my chest, and it was a hand that was of a being that I felt was larger than the 3.5 to 4 foot tall humanoids that I was looking in front of me, because it covered my entire chest and abdomen. But I felt either a hand or something like a hand pushing me gently back on the table. I had no urge to resist for some reason, even though I was protesting, why they brought me here. Pushed me down to a supine position, and I quickly became unconscious. And that's how that episode ends.
Fascinating.
At the age of 6 years old, which incidentally is the most common age that abductees first recall their first encounter.
Do you remember anything about the room itself? There seems to be a lot of accounts, including that of Betty and Barney's, where he said that the craft was sort of a pancake shape, but when they were inside it, it was strangely bigger than what would seem to fit inside, as an airplane. So do you remember anything about the dimensions of the room that you were in?
The only way I can speak to that is to tell you what I've discussed in the book, which is that although I knew I was in a separate room, and there was, I call it a doorway that's the size of what I would think would be the size of an American garage door. I didn't know if there was actual door that had recessed into the ceiling, but it was an open doorway with a frame to it. And I know outside that doorway seemed to be a hallway where there were beings walking back and forth. And I had the sense that there were many rooms in this particular environment next to the room, on either side of the room I was in. I couldn't tell exactly how large what I thought was the inside of a UFO was, but I just knew that there were probably other rooms like the one I was in, and that these beings were traveling either on an automatic walkway or walking back and forth on a long, along a very long hallway that was part of a large, I won't say hangar, but it was some type of building, which I feel was probably the inside of a UFO.
It's fascinating, fascinating.
No other
And
details. No other details.
no. Well, and another question then, looking at Betty and Barney, because that was a similar sort of time. When you listen to their tapes, Barney was terrified, and Betty was sort of chatting away as if it was sort of inconvenient, like she was just having a normal day-to-day conversation. Do you remember anything about your emotions at the time, whether you were afraid or?
I think I allude to this in the book, but I've often thought that the beings took advantage of my insatiable curiosity as a child. I was probably at my heart fascinated with this experience. I'd never, fortunately for me as a child, I never had any fear. The only emotion I felt at that time in that incident I just related to you was one of indignation. Never had any fear during these experiences or afterward that would cause me to experience any trauma at all. Now, I know for a fact that I've recalled consciously, never had any regressive hypnosis, only a small percentage of what really happened to me. But just to follow up on this point I'm making, 6 or 7 years after that experience, when I probably was 12 or 13 years old, I had another abduction encounter where I'm asleep in my bed. And again, it's in the summertime, but I'm awakened dramatically and spontaneously out of a sound sleep, as if someone pulled up my torso, like a marionette would pull a puppet up from a lying to a sitting position, instantaneously awake. And I am fascinated because for some reason, I have the conscious awareness I'm about to have contact with something transcendent. I didn't know if it was a ghost. I didn't know if it was some type of non-human being that from the afterworld or from another world. But I knew that I had to get up out of my bed, get out of my bedroom and leave my house, walk across the street to my neighbor's yard, and had a meeting with something again that was represented contact with something that human beings don't normally have any contact with. And at this point, I was able to see a light in the sky, and which looked like an alien being. And at that point, I was rendered unconscious. Now, at the end of this particular encounter, I simply walked back to my house, very mystified, almost embarrassed, didn't know what the meaning of this particular encounter was. It certainly was unsatisfying to me because much of it I knew then and I know now was erased from my memory. I never had any fear. As I described during the entire encounter, I was motivated only by curiosity. Went up back into my bedroom, got into bed, and fell asleep. Now I know Barney Hill was a very intelligent man. I know before being taken into the UFO to the land of UFO with his wife Betty, had reached into the glove compartment of his car for his revolver, but thought better of it and put it back into the glove compartment. I think in that instant concluded that the best way for to ensure that he and Betty would survive this encounter, which fortunately they did survive, was to just go along with the program, not resist. And so although he was very afraid at that time, and even during the subsequent regressive hypnotic sessions with his psychiatrist, Dr. Benjamin Simon, at least he had the presence of mind to make it out alive. And I don't know what percentage of abductees don't return, but I'm convinced some of them don't make it back. But his presence of mind, although he had a lot of fear, and allowed him to get Betty and Barney Hill out of that UFO, and they were able to get back home. And that's something I respect about him. I know as an adult, knowing what I know now, if I went through what he and Betty went through, I probably would have been significantly more fearful than I was as a child.
Bruce, can I ask, as a scientist, I mean, you've had this experience, you've had a renewed kind of interest later in life. Yeah, and as you say, you've got that sort of memory from earlier on, but things life takes over, doesn't it? And then later in life you have this renewed interest. How do you apply science to your experience? How do you go investigating? How do you put your kind of science hat on and assess this data? Because it's a world where there doesn't seem to be a way to assess data, and that's me in a somebody that's never had to assess in a data-driven environment. I'm not a scientist, but how do you apply science to your experience?
Well, you start by applying the scientific method. You formulate a valid hypothesis. You always entertain alternative hypotheses. Now, I thought that all the facts of my experiences were best explained by the alien abduction model. Many people, scientists, non-scientists, those in the UFO community or those outside the community, have sought to explain the abduction experience as being due to sleep paralysis. So I've tried to use the scientific method to analyze whether or not there's any validity to this. And in my case, I had no medical conditions, psychological conditions, post-traumatic stress disorder, that can cause an interruption of sleep, which is the final common denominator that can predispose to sleep paralysis. Nothing that would cause me to have recurrent sleep paralysis, that from which an alien abduction scenario could be an artifact, a byproduct. In addition, many people, including myself, I would say the majority of people who report being abductees, alien abductees, have these experiences when they were awake. When they might have been driving in a car with their family, and they may have a UFO close encounter. The car transmission fails, and they report that their family members being turned off, or rendered unconscious, or paralyzed, and then they recall an abduction event while they were awake. So I try to use the scientific method to try to obtain evidence to support the most likely hypothesis while ruling out alternative hypotheses. Beyond that, in my unabridged version, I have two versions of the book, Dominion Lost: A Scientist's Own Alien Abduction Encounters. In the unabridged version, I try to explain in depth, and I take 3 or 4 chapters to do this, how these alien implants, I'm also one of the abductees, and we're about 10 or 20% of the abductee population can recall evidence of alien implants. I'm one of those, and I've tried to explain what I think they represent, materials they're made of, the type of energy they use to maybe project energy into the human brain, and in order to manipulate human mental activity, and what their purpose is, why the aliens might use them to try to study human brain function. So I spent several chapters in the unabridged version to deal with this particular aspect of the abduction phenomenon that goes into much greater depth than almost all the books that in the UFO literature that deal with this particular aspect. I also deal with, just out of curiosity, even though I'm not a physicist. I'm so fascinated with how the UFOs work, how they're able to demonstrate such fantastic maneuverability and manifest, go from 0 to 20,000 miles per hour instantaneously. What kind of a propulsion system does a UFO have to be able uh, to create instant acceleration? And I talk a lot about the experience of Bob Lazar and build upon that and try to discuss how gravitation. He claims that he back engineered a alien gravity drive on one of the 9 UFOs that are housed at Area 51, and I try to discuss how such a propulsion system can generate the gravitational energy that is necessary for such a gravity drive to work. So a lot of the scientific analysis I've done in my book was directly related to the experiences I've had, the abduction experiences in particular, but also, it's also related to other aspects of the phenomenon that really don't pertain to what happened to me, what I experienced.
You've mentioned a scoop mark under your knee and a potential scar at the back of your throat. So even just using human technology, what could we glean from that kind of sample?
Well, let me talk about the scar at the back of my throat, because I think the most shocking thing I read about in the UFO abduction literature in the 80s was the fact that a number of abductees at the same age I was when I had my first conscious recall of an abduction event can recall these nasal implants, which I can recall at the age of 6. I remember that being told that I had an implant. I recall the structure. It was a 2 to 3 millimeter diameter metallic sphere that had studs or projections like you'd see on the outside of a thimble that people use for sewing. And I recall that I must be careful that if I sneezed, blew my nose too hard, it could come out. That's how I knew it was a nasal implant. So I had this very concrete memory with an emotional context to it that convinced me that this really happened to me. In the UFO abduction literature in the 80s, other abductees recalled similar implants. They recall having unexplained nosebleeds associated with a period of missing time, which happened to me. And in one particular case, there were 2 physicians that found in the individual who also reported having the nasal implant and had the unexplained nosebleeds. An emergency room physician found a scar in the back of the throat behind the nasal cavity. And at the time of, I guess, I think it was 2 or 3 years later, an ear, nose, and throat surgeon found the same scar because the patient at the age of 6 years old was having a tonsillectomy and also their adenoids removed. I had the same procedure at the same age. And in both cases, in my case, in the case of this abductee, the ENT surgeon found the scar. Now, in the other case, the scar was fairly fresh and bled so profusely that the surgeon had to cauterize it. In fact, the surgeon reported that was the most complicated part of the procedure. The cauterization of this wound, he didn't know what the origin of the wound was, and it was much simpler than removing the adenoids or tonsils from this particular patient. Now, I told my physician, I had a question which mystified him. I'd asked my surgeon, why did I have to have 2 procedures? Because I thought the procedure I'd had 6 months before had actually happened in some type of hospital. And he looked at me with a very confused look. So, I talk about in the book that one function I would imagine for these particular devices, these implants, is a brain-computer interface. And I refer to the work of Elon Musk that he's doing at Neuralink, where he's actually implanting brain-computer interfaces in the brain of paraplegics that allow them to move motorized limbs. And these implants are also thought to be able to restore function in people that have lost the ability to speak because they've had strokes. And so these brain-computer interfaces can be used to allow them to communicate with using an external computer that's interfacing with these implants. So as an extrapolation of that, I've imagined and discussed it at length in my book that these implants are probably used for research purposes by some alien species to download human mental activity and study how the human brain works to the point where I would think an advanced civilization would be able to play the human mind like a piano. Now, what's the purpose of this? One hypothesis is that they're attempting to use this technology to not just to study us, but not for our benefit, but to use the technology in order to use us, exploit us, or control our species. The other hypothesis is that they're using maybe direct brain stimulation along with alteration of the human genome in a reproductive program where they take genetic material from abductees and try to create a transgenic human species with the overall purpose of accelerating our evolution so that perhaps we can be capable of interacting with other advanced civilizations and perhaps join at least in our galactic neighborhood, join the cosmic community. So that's what I would imagine the purpose of these implants could be. It could be for a nefarious purpose, or it could be for our benefit, perhaps. I'm open to both theories.
It's fascinating stuff. Fascinating, and I thank you for sharing. I mean, it's quite a personal thing, isn't it? It's very it's laying out that kind of vulnerability, and it does interest me. And how now that you've published this book and you're very open about your experience and your research, how are your peers responding to it? How is the rest of the sort of scientific community responding to it? Is the stigma still there? Is it changing? Is there still a hell of a lot of stigma compared to UFOs and abduction? Is there a difference between the two in terms of stigma? How do you see it?
Well, fortunately, Jimmy, so far I've had no negative feedback, only positive, and people with science backgrounds have related to me how much the book affected them. In one case, one was a non-believer with a mathematical computer science background who claims I've opened his mind now to the possibility that we're not alone, that we're actually interacting with advanced alien beings. I have to say, without divulging too much information, that I've been contacted by one of my readers who has a very high level position in the American aerospace community that has come forward with similar experiences to the one I've had. And so, I hope this is the beginning of a process in which other people with science background also come forward and feel encouraged to report what's happened to them. But I've had a lot of encouragement from people who I would have to classify as skeptics, clearly skeptics before they read my book. So, overall, the feedback has been encouraging rather than negative.
Excellent. Fantastic. That's interesting. That really is. And that's really good to hear. Really good to hear, because that's what we want. We want sort of science and engineering to just embrace this subject. A question on that, really, if that's okay. if you had and it's a, it's one of those wild questions that, if you had a unlimited budget, what would you do if you had an unlimited budget and an unlimited team of whoever you needed in science? Where would be the best place to direct your energies and efforts, do you think? Have you thought that through, that, if I was able to just take on a team of anyone I wanted, what area would I just dive into to
Well,
push them?
I've thought about it, and I've, initially thought perhaps NASA. I know colleagues of mine have had, biologists have had research projects, research conducted on the American Space Shuttle program. So I know they have that capability, but I really think, well, my dream scenario is that we have a project akin to the Manhattan Project, something of that magnitude, where we would have interdisciplinary study with people, scientists from a number of different disciplines within physics, gravitational physics, particle physics, physicists, and along with neuroscientists, computer scientists, so that we can really study every aspect of the phenomenon in an environment where there's sharing of information, because we can't really anticipate whether or not there's a discovery in material science that might be useful in a project that's trying to understand how the UFO flies. It's in a part of the project that may be trying to reverse engineer a gravity drive. So we need to have sharing information. That's why I'm hoping we can have such a program, if there was funding available to support it, that would probably not be part of the military, only because in the military, the research is so strictly compartmentalized. So the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And that can only be have an inhibitory effect on scientific progress. So that's what I would imagine to be the forum for the way we can put our best foot forward in trying to understand. And I think we have a critical need to understand why alien beings have come to the planet and have interacted so directly and intimately with our citizens. So again, in my, if I had a magic wand, this is the type of program that I would create. Again, if there were enough funds to support it.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much, Bruce. I really appreciate your time and sharing with us. If the listeners wanted to get your book, I'm assuming it's Amazon. So it's Dominion Lost: A Scientist's Own Alien Abduction Encounters.
I don't know if you can see this, but this is the unabridged version, because
wow.
a lot of readers want to experience my UFO close encounters, alien abduction experiences without a lot of scientific analysis. And actually, there's a different cover for the unabridged version. I call it the science heavy version, showing me being beamed up into the UFO. And many of the people that read the shorter book might be interested in some of the science, and they can always take a look at the unabridged version. That's on Amazon. They're both on Amazon under the same title, Dominion Lost: A Scientist's Own Alien Abduction Encounters. And to find out about my public appearances and appearances on podcasts, and also if anyone wants to message me, they can find me on Facebook, under Bruce Rapuano.
Take care of yourself. I really appreciate
Thanks,
that.
Bruce.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity, guys.